Hello, my friends. I am very excited to bring you a great conversation today with Harvard professor and history of science expert, as well as the author of a brand new book that just was released yesterday. It's called The Instability of Truth, Brainwashing, Mind Control, and Hyper-Persuasion. My interview with Dr. Rebecca Lemov is what I've got for you on today's show. As I told you, this week would be sporadic posting in terms of what time I would be posting and what exactly I would be posting, more than just the interviews, which is what I still plan to do. I'm taking a bit of a news break myself, though. I do know that my old friend Jeffrey Goldberg was added to a top secret classified text chat following that story with entertainment, joy, and absolute panic to know that that's how they are communicating, how careless, how inept they are. But that is obviously one of the top stories. The rest I'm mostly trying to ignore, but I'm glad that you're keeping a track of them, or maybe you aren't. Either way, I'm really happy to have you here for today's conversation. Headed to Vegas tomorrow from California, where I've had a wonderful time meeting, hanging out with listeners, and I'm very excited to see all of you who are joining us at PODJAM in Las Vegas this week. Should be a great time. I hope. I mean, I'm nervous. I hope it all comes off without a hitch or without technical issues, or everybody shows up or gets what they need and has a good time and doesn't feel too uncomfortable or awkward or alone, because that's how many of us feel. Socially anxious. Oh, this is weird. I don't know anybody. Am I going to talk to anybody? Yes. Talk to me. I'll be that guy. And I'm happy to connect people. That's what this is all about here in Southern California, as well as in Vegas and at our hangouts. Sorry I wasn't able to host last night or Thursday night. Everything will be back to the normal format next week. But this week, it's PODJAM. And today, I've got Dr. Professor Rebecca Lemov joining me. I think you're going to love this conversation and this book. Like I said, she's a historian of science at Harvard. She's been a visiting scholar at the Max Planck Institute. And her research explores data, technology, and the history of human and behavioral sciences. I thought this was a really important conversation to have because brainwashing affects both the world and our observation of the world. We don't often recognize it while it's happening unless we know where to look. And I don't want that to happen to me. I think we are all vulnerable to all kinds of different brainwashing, where we also in this conversation talk about the root of it and what it even means. But the instability of truth exposes the myriad ways our minds can be controlled against our will, from the brainwashing techniques used against American POWs in North Korea to, quote, soft brainwashing of social media, doom scrolling, and behavioral shaping, which is why I thought this conversation would be really important for all of us to know our best, how we can prevent ourselves from being brainwashed by any number of people who consider themselves experts or family members, friends, people that we look up to. I never want to be that source or that guy. Obviously, I choose who comes on this show. I believe them almost all the time, think that they have credibility, give them all of mine, and hope that it is good enough for you and real enough and accurate and credible enough. So that's what I try to do each and every day. And I think that's exactly why I wanted to have Dr. Lemov join me for the first time on Stand Up. I hope you'll get the book and support her, follow her on social media. But let's do it right now. My conversation with this brilliant mind on a very important issue. Dr. Rebecca Lemov, welcome to Stand Up for the first time. It is really great to have you here, to have a historian of science. I feel like your job is more important now than ever before, because it seems like we're trying to erase a lot of it. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So tell me how you chose this path of research and study. You are a historian of science. You've written several books now. You've gone to and work at some of the best institutions in the world. But why have you chosen this as your research?
Well, the answer that occurs to me is that, you know how they say when you rescue a dog, like they choose you as much as you choose them. Not to say that my research is a rescue dog, but I do feel a deep connection with the research. And I do feel that even though I chose it, it also shows me I've been working on this topic of human engineering, social engineering, behavioral engineering, and then I guess what I consider one of its more extreme or pervasive variants, mind control, brainwashing, for about 25 years. So through my graduate education and through different fields I've been part of, I've ended up somewhat looping back to this topic constantly.
Well, you talk about your own personal life and experiences. Why do you do that? You don't have to do that as an academic or an author, I suppose.
Yeah, this is I think it's the first book where I wrote myself in, and I suppose I could have written myself in even more, but I had this funny experience, which is sometimes when I talk to people, they say, well, surely you can't have very deep experience in areas of cults or being an academic, being an intellectual, or having lots of credentials. But when a few years ago, I went to the annual meeting of the International Cultic Studies Association with a focus on people who had survived sexual abuse in cults. And when I was I would introduce myself to various people at the conference, and they would always say, oh, I'd say I'm a professor, because it could be for people who have survived, people who work as therapists or researchers. And I'd say, I'm a researcher, I'm a professor. And they'd always say, look at me again and say, no, but why are you really here? They'd always discern some deeper thing. And I'd say, I didn't really have an answer at the moment, but there is an answer on two levels, which is that I embarked on this as an intellectual project, but in that way that the universe sometimes delivers you personal experience. That did happen to me, where one is a more superficial involvement, you could say, with something that seemed cult-like in graduate school, where I just started to adopt and become entranced with theories. And this kind of group I was with, we all became very interested in kind of high-level writing in a different way, or using jargon and sounding really smart and getting carried away with French theorists. And it was the time. And at a certain point, I looked at what I had written and I showed it to a friend. I was very proud of it. And he was a journalist. And he said, that doesn't even sound like you. That doesn't even sound like English.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so I course corrected pretty quickly, because I like the idea that people could actually understand, and you yourself could understand what you're trying to say. Not to say that these theorists are valueless at all, but just that it can become this kind of group phenomenon where you're vying to outdo each other with inscrutable sayings.
I don't know. I think I can relate, but it's at a much lower level. What was the other kind of experience that you had?
Well, the other thing was just getting caught in an addiction, and also a relationship that went with that drug addiction, and just thinking it was like a casual thing. And then finding myself after time losing track of friends, losing connections with family, and just getting stuck in a position that I didn't really think that would happen to me. And realizing that the more you're in that position, the more difficult it becomes to get out. And it's almost like a spell. You have a terrible spell cast on you. So once I did fortunately break the spell, I had this kind of personal experience in the kinds of things where people say, like, how could that have happened? Or why didn't you just walk out the door? Things like that.
How did you break the spell?
Well, it is interesting.
Yeah.
I think that I consider it good fortune, not any kind of, I didn't think myself out of it, but just that a friend of mine, I had a wake up call when a friend of mine one friend that I hadn't cut ties with said something like, he acts like he's got his foot on your neck all the time. And that he's a lot smarter than you and funnier and handsomer, but none of those things are true. And it's just very shocking to realize that I'd gotten to the point where I just didn't think that I deserved to have a good life or something like that. So anyway, it was almost like all the theoretical experiments and behavioral scientists I'd been writing about who had tried to create a theory about how extensively human beings could be controlled. In some way, I had a taste of it.
Mind control, brainwashing. This is what we're talking about. But we're also talking about, you mentioned theorists. There's a lot of pop psychology and even more increasingly philosophy. And let me just tell you, I fall for all of it. I eat it up, the Daily Stoic, and I love Dan Harris and 10% Happy, all of his guests and so on. But what would you call all of that? Can I say it's an industry? It's obviously a science. There's all kinds of ways to talk about it. But does that fall into this? If I'm listening to a certain type of podcast or a certain type of philosophy a lot, Isn't that a kind of brainwashing if all I do is read and practice the Stoics?
I think it's in the same ballpark as, it depends how you define brainwashing. If you use a wide definition, which maybe a second part to my book would be positive brainwashing. There are ways you can transform yourself by the judicious adoption of, and even immersion in philosophies, practices, powerful ancient techniques like the Stoics. It's possible to change your own mind. It's just, I think that the issue, and that's one reason people fall into cults. They have positive experiences. They have exhilarating experiences. Oh, yeah. Sometimes they have genuine spiritual experiences of human connection, love, and even ecstasy, things like that. Those are but they are addictive. So it's the point at which the sort of feedback loop takes over and one is just continually resubscribing and without reflection or having lost the ability to reflect or the perspective.
I feel like in reading your book and learning about you, I personally come away with looking at myself and my own views on things and how I've been affected throughout my life and why I believe what I believe, as well as reading your book through the lens of our society, our culture today. And so I have just one more question just about all of this personally for me, for my own self, my own life. How important is a kind of self-awareness and self-examination of what you think and why you think it? When I first started in this world, I had been doing stand-up comedy and then I started doing radio and then a talk show. What I wanted to do is learn how to, quote, critically think. That was the phrase I used then, and that's a phrase that people use now. But I'm talking about critically thinking about me, my own self-awareness, my own self-examination. And I guess I would submit trying to continue to figure it out, to be better, to improve on my faults and stop biting my nails and make my bed. And those are just the easy ones.
So the question is,
how important is the self-examination and the self-analysis? Because reading your book, I felt like I was doing that a lot to myself. So I know where I'm brainwashed or how I'm brainwashed.
Yeah, that's exactly the goal of the book, is to not for me to say you need to examine yourself, but for me to examine myself and model that. It's built into the book.
Right.
The way I think about it and talk about it. And I have been working on this for 25 years. So many of these things took years to sink in, but I think self-examination is at the heart of it, because it's so easy when you hear about a scam or an absurd cult. Say Keith Raniere used to tell his followers that the rain fell on them, but it didn't fall on him. And he'd be like, I have a little, he would just say absurd things or claim to be very handsome or super intelligent. I think you say to yourself, I would never have fallen for that. Those are not illogical things that I would have fallen. So there's a constant self-distancing from these processes. But I think the main lesson I drew is that we're all subject to them. It's just the personal ways we're subject ourselves are usually invisible to ourselves. We can see it in other people.
The title of your book is The Instability of Truth, which is a brilliant set of words, I guess. Brainwashing, mind control, and hyper-persuasion explains a little bit more about what your book is about. But I often now use this phrase, and I hear others use it as well, Earth 1 and Earth 2. And so the question is about truth. And all of this, I hope the listener understands, is me trying to make sure that I understand the issues that you're an expert on as much as I can, so that I can be the best possible host when talking about all the important issues that we talk about with a wide range of viewpoints and experiences. It's just a question about truth. Like we feel like we are losing ourselves in today's world. And I try to keep connected to other people so that we can have a consistency to what our truth is. So how do you just unpack that word in 2025?
Yes, that's a great question. So truth, I have a dad my dad passed away, but one of the last, he really liked the fact that I was writing this book. He worked in government for many years. He worked for the Justice Department.
Wow.
And I like everything about your book, but the title troubles me. It shouldn't be the instability of truth. It should be the end of truth, something much more dramatic. But I think actually the destabilization of truth is what provokes a kind of ungrounding, which is one of the main discoveries that I found in my research, is that before any of the actual techniques, you can name the 8 techniques, the 12 techniques, whatever, the recipes for a kind of brainwashing or mind control or thought reform, before any of those occur, a kind of profound ungrounding has to happen, which I define as successive shocks to the point of disorientation. And I think that can apply in such a wide range of situations. And when we're dealing with the ground of truth, which has to do with a kind of shared reality, that presents a real challenge because it provokes all kinds of responses, grasping for some greater truth, grasping for a narrative, grasping for connections with other people too.
Let me just ask you then I feel like one of the most relevant questions I think you would be especially prepared to answer, which is being a historian of science and then writing this book about how our brains work, really, and control and persuasion, the history. Let's just specifically talk about vaccines, the miracle that they've been for public health around the world, and now the questioning that has begun for years around them, and the people that we have now in charge. I asked the question, how do you explain, given the history, which is settled, I think, not too controversial about what happened and how it happened, the outcomes, and now where we are at? Because I feel like people don't know history, and so it's not hard for them to unlearn a thing or learn a new thing, which you can explain, I'm sure, a lot better. But your thoughts on that issue, the history of vaccines, and how people have become so scrambled?
Yeah, I think, well, there are people in my department, because I'm in the history of science department, we have historians of medicine, and they actually teach whole classes on vaccines and the history of vaccination.
Great.
And it's a seriously illuminating topic and really worth, I think, a little bit of history, which is what circulates quite a bit and on popular sites can actually be distorting. So I would recommend books and interviews with people like Alan Brandt and David Jones, who are medical historians in my department. I think the knowledge about vaccines has been destabilized because of a distrust in public health during pre-existing COVID and then growing during COVID. And there are real reasons for that to have happened, but it doesn't mean it's a public good for vaccines to be abandoned, especially the kinds of vaccines that children receive.
Yeah, it just seems like if you knew the history of measles, we wouldn't be arguing right now about that. You're like, did you not know what happened? Same thing with the history of democracy or history of anything. If you never knew it, then it's not hard to misunderstand it or lose it in this case.
Yeah, history is very profound. It sounds like a silly thing to say, but it's funny that the word history has become a liability in university circles. I think sometimes students or others treat it as, well, that's inherently irrelevant. What can that have to do with the latest technology, the latest STEM fields, et cetera? But it's actually profound, I think, for each science to know its own history.
Absolutely. Yeah. And each country and each society and each town, and let's go on and on about the importance of history. Getting back to the book, The Instability of Truth, this is a really fascinating and very important issue for all kinds of reasons. But why do you think that someone should want to read this if it's sitting out front of airport or anything? This is right up my alley. I loved it. As soon as I heard about your book, I said, I have to read this and I have to talk to this person. And then when I read out who you were, I was like, well, this will be intimidating. So the easy question is, who wants to read this? What are the questions, some of the questions? Because it's so fascinating in terms of real history, real brainwashing tactics, techniques, why they were employed, and so much more. I can't in any way summarize it.
Well, one quick question before I answer is, did you find it to be intimidating or overly scholarly, or did you find it? Yeah.
No, but I don't know. I suppose I could find plenty of reading intimidating Shakespeare and other things, plenty of great authors. But no, I think you wrote it for me and others like me.
Yeah.
We're curious people, that to say the least.
That's exactly, because I also write it for myself. Like, I think even though it's a dark topic, I actually went on a true crime podcast not so long ago, and they said, I was like, people who deal with murder every day, I didn't think that I could shock them with materials in my book, but they're like, wow, you really work the dark side here. You're really delving into topics that we wouldn't even touch. But I think that despite the fact that there are certain episodes that are very heavy in the book, like that do have to do with interrogation, with torture, with like people at the limits of their experience, and also with trivial things like crypto crypto speculation. At the same time, I wrote it to be enjoyable and to be satisfying of my own curiosity. So I have a pet peeve about books that are just impossible to read or make you suffer. So
No, none of that happened. Suffering was having empathy for people who have been through some of the things that you write about, for sure. But let's get into some of the specifics, because obviously there's a lot to discuss in terms of war, in terms of the history of war and how brainwashing was used. But do we want to talk about the kind of history of where it first appeared? Because I think it has to do with conflict.
Yeah, it really emerges out of the first war the U.S. fought after World War II. Because before then, even though soldiers had been turned as prisoners of war, it wasn't till the Korean War that the term brainwashing emerged, and this phenomenon came to the attention of the highest levels of the military, that Air Force pilots were confessing to having flown germ warfare missions and having dropped bacteriological weapons over China after they'd been interrogated and tortured. But not only that, there was something seemed to be going on behind the scenes to prisoners, to U.S. prisoners and UN prisoners, that they couldn't explain. And then in 1953, 21 American GIs declared that they chose not to return to the United States, but would rather go to a communist country, and decided to settle in China just because they had been, they said that they had wholeheartedly adopted, and they were singing folk songs and they were appearing on camera. But at the level of the military, this was seen as a new communist weapon, that mind weapon or kind of virus that they had subjected the troops to. Which was a re-education or a brainwashing. Really, it was quite simple that Mao and a core of Chinese instructors had been deputized to try out Maoist re-education on the U.S. troops who were held behind the Yalu River in several camps. But what is often ignored, I think, sometimes ignored, is what the men had gone through before they entered the re-education segment of their captivity, and just the almost unspeakable conditions, and not just unspeakable, but almost surreal things they had been through, like losing half of their body weight, dying simply from exhaustion, being on forced marches, having to eat millet with worms in it. And one GI died simply by thinking of hamburgers. He never woke up the next morning. His friend said, because it is just this kind of torture. Another GI who ended up going to China, he had to amputate his own toes using a spoon because he had gangrene and there was no medical care. And people would die going to the latrine just because they didn't have the strength, if they fell in, to pull themselves out of the trench. The Korean War is known as the Forgotten War in the U.S. at least, but it's extraordinary to me how little, considering how much attention has gone to the Vietnam War and other conflicts, that it really is forgotten in a lot of what they went through. If people, again, ever learned it, I certainly didn't know the specifics of some of those things, or that it started then and then obviously continued in other conflicts around the world. You also even talk about how in the United States, when special forces members have to go through this special schooling, SEER training, and they get tortured and have to go through all kinds of things. Are we still doing that, by the way, that program, Survival, Evasion, Resistance, Escape training program for SEALs? Because that's brainwashing tactics being employed on them as a way to help them defend against brainwashing tactics? Exactly. The SEER camps, which are Survival, Evasion, Resistance, Escape, they pre-existed the Korean War, but the resistance part was designed directly from and using the same experts who had studied the POWs, then designed U.S. procedures, military procedures that would simulate or create the same conditions that the men had, that these GIs had gone through, the POWs, and they would include also waterboarding. And it was really the combination of deprivation, brutality, and psychological torture that was routinized, and 100,000 men were first run through it in the 50s. This is still done. It's been modified over the years, and now military personnel go through at different levels. So only if there's a danger that you might be captured by enemy forces and held as a prisoner or interrogated in certain ways, you go to level C. It's also, you have to take a vow not to talk about it. So there's not always free information available, but it is still used. It was somewhat modified in that there's also a mental health screening beforehand. And also there was a recent study about 10 years ago by a Yale psychiatrist who said that pretty much 100% of the men who went, and women now, who went through this did sustain traumatic damage from it, but they also gained some benefits that some were able to use in their service.
Well, they were able to gain benefits they're using their service, and then when their service is over, the trauma often remains. And also, a lot of those guys that swore an oath not to say anything about the training have fucking books and podcasts just talking all about that stuff. But really important, to your point, I just had to make a pithy remark because I'm a jerk and I'm jealous that nobody wanted me to be a SEAL, even though I have a great physique. All right, so tell me about Louis Jolly West. You write about this he was a psychiatrist and he was this longtime consultant and contractor for the CIA. And I thought that was a particularly important and fascinating part. Where did you meet this guy in your research and why did you include him in your book? And can I get him on the show?
Well, no, to the last question, no. And he wouldn't have come on your show. I'm going to, for him on his behalf, saying refuse the invitation because he always denied. Ever since the 80s, he denied that he had any connection with the CIA. And people, I think they believed him because he was so prominent. He was such a huge luminary in the field of psychiatry. He ran the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute for many decades. And he came to he's really a fascinating life. In a sense, he's the anti-hero or maybe villain of my book. But I keep going back to his archives over the last 15 years. And at first I was bringing my daughter and she would not go into the archives with me, but she would visit with her grandmother and she was a little girl. And now she's actually done some research with me. So I've grown up with just the mystery of this fellow who went by the name Jolly and who apparently was very, he had this kind of effervescent personality. He was huge. He looked like a linebacker. They said like the friendliest linebacker you could have met, but he was deep in the CIA's MK Ultra programs, and he seemed to have this kind of innate understanding of what they wanted done, what Sid Gottlieb, who was the head of MK Ultra, wanted done, which was a kind of free experimentation in the zone of how deeply you could dissociate people or create a kind of human automaton.
MK Ultra is this human experimentation program designed and undertaken by the CIA to develop procedures and identify drugs that could be used during interrogations to weaken individuals, force confessions through brainwashing and psychological torture, is my quick Wikipedia. Is that fair?
That's fair.
And Jolly is a fascinating guy. Just real quick, this guy that you're going to tell us more about, he apparently examined, you write about this, Patty Hearst and Jack Ruby as the expert psychologist. Is that right?
That's correct. He was so well known, and he was actually an expert in what he called debility, dependency, and despair. I think it was which were the states that he identified when someone became brainwashed, because he was one of the people who examined the first returning POWs who had experienced brainwashing. So he really was. He was an expert. And when Patty Hearst was abducted and then tried in the mid-1970s, he was the logical person. And he even put himself forward, actually. He said, what I'm seeing, what happened to Patty Hearst is what I saw with the POWs. He didn't say that he had worked with the CIA or had run his own experiments or had set up an experimental lab at the military base or had many other secret experiments that he had undertaken. But he was so well known that he was, in some sense, the obvious person to do these examinations.
Tell us a little bit more about what you uncovered in all of that research that you brought your daughter with. I liked thinking about what that must be like. I want to hear her point of view on those trips. What does mom do? Jolly, leave me alone, child.
Now that she's in her 20s, I had to hold back on my describing my research to her sometimes when she was younger. I'd be like, right. I probably shouldn't have said that.
That's what I learned today on the way home. What did you do with grandma? But tell us a little bit about what you uncovered for your book.
Well, what I uncovered is that West had a kind of unerring instinct, and even before the POWs even before they defected or made their choice not to return, he was already deeply involved in a program to create dissociative states at will using a combination of sleep deprivation, that was one of his areas, LSD and other psychoactive agents, and hypnosis. And one of the experiments he brags about is using hypnosis instead of anesthesia, hyperesthesia. So could he create pain under hypnosis instead of reducing it? He also said he experimented on 2 men undergoing emergency circumcisions by using hypnosis and raising many questions, which he never fully answered. But he was an expert on hypnosis as well. And
we're not going to just fly past emergency circumcisions only because I'm not being childish. I just don't understand why it would be an emergency. It seems like a planned event is all I'm saying. Either a religious event or upon birth. Maybe we don't need to know.
No, until I entered the Louis Jolyon West files, I never knew there was such a thing. I'm not the world's expert on that, but I took it as almost a threat. It's like he basically declared that he was running experiments in what was supposed to be an emergency health situation, which was never fully explained, but he would mention this sometimes in his letters or communications with lectures sometimes he would give to other medical professionals. So maybe
convincing a potential patient that they needed this as a way to experiment on them. It sounds like some of the stuff wasn't very ethical that he was doing.
Yeah, it was deeply unethical what he was doing. And a lot of more than one might think of research during the 50s and 60s was at the very edge of treatment. So people were patients desperate for treatment. Sometimes in the psychiatric domains, a lot was unknown, and also becoming an experimental subject without being told or fully informed of the protocol, because it just was. And West went far further than that, in that he was the lead psychiatrist at the Lackland Air Force Base. So he's in charge of all psychiatric cases, and he was in direct communication with MK Ultra to set up a secret CIA facility at the Air Force Base where he could run experiments that combine sleep deprivation, LSD, the implementation of LSD in human subjects, and also hypnosis. So in whatever degrees and combination he desired.
Now I want to meet him even more. He's gone. Before I let you go, I just want to ask you a couple common, just very other relevant things that you write about. Talk about this experiment that Facebook did with almost 1 million people without us knowing, to see if they could manipulate our moods. I don't know why they need an experiment. The answer is yes. Every time I launch Facebook, the same things happen to me, and they almost are never good. Can you explain what you learned about this and how our own emotions they can spread? Your post can affect me and mine can affect you, and not back, but the next person. Explain about this experiment, what you learned.
Yeah, I think you put your finger exactly on the kind of paradox of this experiment. Did it really need to be run? Because experiments are being run all the time, and they call them A/B testing. I had students, and I used to teach a class on big data, its history and future. I had undergraduates who would spend a summer working for what was then Twitter or whatever social media platform. They'd say, oh, they gave us 20,000 users. We could change the parameters of their accounts or things like that. It's just maybe change the way the scroll worked or how the colors of the background or things like subtle changes. But in fact, Facebook, the fact that they ran a kind of formal experiment and published it in 2014 in PNAS, which is a very prominent scientific journal, was really a significant part of this experiment. There were 693,000 users who were selected without being told that they would be part of this manipulation of their news feed. And so one group received a more negative news feed than previously they had been exposed to. So they changed the algorithm to get, and the negativity was sometimes more intensified in certain users than others. And then another set of users was presented with a more emotionally positive newsfeed. And then there was a control group. And the positively adjusted newsfeed did post more positive things or respond in more positive ways in a measurable fashion. The negatively skewed newsfeed users then posted far more negatively, and this was scientifically significant, statistically significant, and the control just went on as usual. So the experiment was described as mass emotional contagion, which was a pre-existing concept that had been worked out in a famous paper in 1990. But they actually, in a sense, their paper, the Facebook research team and its affiliated authors were basically making this kind of public declaration that they had operationalized contagion and that you didn't have to be present, because previously, of course, people knew that emotional contagion worked in one-to-one relationships or sometimes across networks, sure, as in the work of Nicholas Christakis, but friend networks or social networks, even heart conditions, emotional conditions could spread, but the fact that they could spread online through digital and not necessarily through two-way interaction, but just really through receipt of messages.
I think I'm in an experiment now where my whole timeline is my friend's pets dying.
Oh, I know.
I'm joking, but I'm thinking of all the reasons that every time I launch Facebook, it's bad. Or you could argue any other number of social media networks too. And it depends on how you, I suppose, whatever control you have over curating what you don't have a lot of control, it would seem over that either. So we could talk about that forever, and we should another time. But before I wrap up the book, I feel like I haven't even gotten enough into it. What is there? One more part of the book that I haven't asked about that you haven't talked about in this or any other interview you think that you might want to mention? Because otherwise, I'm going to ask you 10 more really important questions, and we'll be here for a long time.
Oh, is there one more?
One more specific thing that you wanted to, I want to ask you about the whole crypto community thing, but I'm not sure it's the most important part. It's important. All of it is, but there's just more at the beginning that I still barely scratched the surface on.
Yeah, the book covers a lot of ground, but I try to get really into the deep, just what it's like of these things, because I think a lot of writing about brainwashing for years was a hysteria response of the Cold War, and the experts knew that there was nothing really to it. But actually, I think it is a real phenomenon at the same time as it was also spreading throughout the culture. So I think the part that there are many specific stories that we haven't gotten to, but what I keep coming back to is just that I'm trying to locate the normality. So you have extreme experiences like what happened to POWs or someone abducted into an extreme cult, but there's an ordinariness to it. If you actually go back and talk to them, which many people didn't for years, you find that it was also ordinary for them. Like one story I'll just maybe end with is one of the I was struck by this. I was reading a lot of oral histories of POWs. And one of the men said that he was 17 years old when he signed up. He didn't go back to his senior year in high school. He came from upstate New York. He'd never been abroad in 1950 from a farming household. He lands in Korea to fight in what he doesn't even yet know is a war, because it was called a police action. And as they're pulling into Incheon Harbor, he's given a can of ham and lima beans, and he really doesn't like lima beans, like most people, I guess. He decided, because he didn't have any place to store it, he would just throw it out overboard. And he, didn't think anything of it. But when a couple of weeks later he was captured, and then for the next several years he was held as a prisoner, he almost starved to death. He went through the things I had described. He couldn't stop thinking about the can of lima beans at the bottom of the harbor, and he imagined it rusting. He just thought that he had never regretted anything so much in his life as throwing away that can of food that he now was so in need of. And I was just thinking, you often want to turn these extreme experiences into like unspeakable things, but they're actually made up of ordinary moments, just like the ordinary moments we're all exposed to.
So well said and really well written. Lima beans at the bottom of the ocean. That's actually chapter 1 in the first part of your book titled Brainwashing Arrives. Wow, what a pleasure to get the opportunity to talk to you and to read your book. And I hope that we could do it again, because there's so much more to discuss. And it's just really interesting. Let me just ask you real quick, this last question about a kind of a political brainwashing, specifically like this idea of the big lie. That's not new. Experts refer to Hitler doing it. If you repeat over and over that Canada isn't really its own country, people begin to believe it. If you repeat something over and over, even if you're not denying a long-held truth, what is that? What is that called? It seems very simple. It seems like advertising. It seems like branding. It's just, but in this case, it's a political leader saying something over and over. It's not Coca-Cola telling me how refreshing their drink is.
Yeah, I think one aspect of cult research that it can be brought to bear on the big lie is the idea of thought stopping, which is something that many people who have been in cults have described, which is like you're given through a set of procedures which involve several steps at the end, and it can involve a confession, a struggle, and then like an embrace of a unity. Often you're sleep deprived or you're in destabilizing situation, but thought stopping is a repetitive state in which you can actually almost have an exhilarating effect. It can have an exhilarating effect to succumb to it. And people who underwent either thought reform, Maoist re-education, or buy into an occultic ideology often do describe an exhilaration of just embracing that particular truth. And understanding that, as one survivor of this said, it's a special kind of truth. I think that could be brought to bear on political situations. However, I personally think that one of the lessons I draw from my research is that and as your comments you've been saying this whole time, we're all subject to this. We all open up Facebook. We all, to greater or lesser degrees, experience this destabilization. So I think we all have the tools to recognize it.
You think we do all have the tools to recognize it?
Potentially, yes.
Well, if we read your book and talk to someone like you, I think we need to be given the tool. Like, I feel like my daughters who are 17 and 20, I have to give them these types of ways to think about, watch this documentary, read this book, read this article, so you know what's happening to your brain. We grew up with, this is your brain on drugs. I think I'm just a couple of years older than you, that kind of propaganda. And now I would say these social media platforms are as, if not far more dangerous to our kids than weed was, or whatever that may be, some of the harder drugs. But
that is really true. And the thing we didn't really get to, but maybe we can talk about next time, is meditation, and not simply having a formal practice, but the things. So I think you're right. It's a real danger to people who have less experience, who are younger, I think. And these are powerful tools. And I think it's good that there's a lot more attention being drawn to. Maybe it's not good to have them in schools, or you certainly, as a parent, one of your main roles should be to monitor and moderate and perhaps even not allow exposure of your child to social media until they're.
But go ahead and talk about why meditation you think is instrumental in helping prevent this.
Yeah, because we'd like to draw a bright line, like these things are toxic, these things are not toxic. This is a good exposure, this is not. But I don't find that to be true.
Right.
It's that you can, and it's actually useful to expose yourself to ideas that you don't like, or unsilo yourself if possible. But for me, the main tool is, and in meditation, the same dangers exist. You can, if you meditate sufficient hours, you'll probably go through all kinds of states, a range of states. But the point is not to be attached to those, but you learn a kind of way to just observe sensations. And I think that I try to do this in whatever I'm doing, but with social, say I'm on a platform of some type, just observe at what point, what's happening and where in your body. Like, am I feeling? Yep. And that can give you a real-time monitoring device, and then knowing what action one can take.
Well, exactly that. I had my real-time monitoring device go off yesterday after reading the 9th horrible headline of the hour, and I go, and that's good. I see it. It's my limit, and now it's time to go for an unscheduled walk, which became a really long walk, which I had a great conversation with someone I care about with, and that was my practice telling me I got to call it.
Yeah.
That was enough. Thank you. Well, congratulations on the book. So happy to have you joining me, and I hope everybody goes and gets it, and I look forward to talking to you again.
You too. Thanks so much. It was great to meet you.
Well, there you go. What did you think of that conversation? The Instability of Truth. Brainwashing, Mind Control, and Hyper-Persuasion is the name of the book. You should go get it, and hopefully it can help you understand how to prevent that from happening to you, to me, and just to understand the history of it. I think that's going to continue to be important as we see reality, an effort to erase the reality we see unfolding right before our eyes. That's all I've got for you today. I hope I'll be here tomorrow with another great conversation. Thank you so much for your support and subscribing to the feed. Thank you to Jon Carroll for the music. I'll continue to release cuts from his new album, which you should go get right now. Continue to release those cuts next week. But that's what I've got for you today. Thanks for stopping by. I hope that you are doing all right, and I will connect with you soon. Bye.
Hey, you've been sitting so long, you got the creaky knees, you got to stand up. Stand up. I think you're driving wheels with leaking grease. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Well, there's a whole lot more of us who know what's right. They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. You got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. You got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. So get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense.